And then finally, I want to introduce our moderator for today. Karen Ishizuka is the Chief Curator of the Japanese American National Museum, and she was previously on staff as the media producer, curator, and director of the Frank H. Watase Media Arts Center. So she wears many hats here at the museum. During that time, she curated JANM's influential America's Concentration Camps, Remembering the Japanese American Experience exhibition, established the museum's photographic and moving image archive, and wrote and produced Toyo Miyatake, Infinite Shades of Grey, which was an official selection at the Sundance Film Festival. She's also an incredible scholar, author, and activist, and we are so grateful to have her moderating today. So I'd like to invite Karen to take over now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joy. And thank you all out there for joining us. You know, I realize that there are a lot of webinars lately, and you also could be home Zooming on Netflix, binging on Netflix. So we really appreciate your being here with us tonight. You know, as a prologue to tonight's program, because it's intimately connected, along with countless other Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, I need to say his name, George Floyd. Just a few weeks ago, I also had to say the names of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. You know, there was a recent Time magazine article titled "Violence Against Asian Americans on the Rise," but it's part of a long history. And it quoted one of our panelists, Renee Tajima-Peña, who made the Academy Award-nominated documentary, Who Killed Vincent Chin, the Chinese American who was brutally murdered for simply looking Japanese because the Japanese were scapegoated for causing the auto crisis in the 1980s. So Renee said, Asian Americans need to stop invoking Vincent Chin's name if they ignore the Ahmaud Arbery's that happen on and off camera on a weekly or even daily basis. And now we cannot ignore the murder of George Floyd. You know, as the COVID-19 has spread around the world, so has mistrust, fear, misinformation, xenophobia, and out-and-out racism. Given the okay to hate by the leaders of this country, African Americans, all people of color, women, members of the LGBTQ communities, immigrants, refugees, Jews, have all experienced heightened acts of violence, verbal, physical, and lethal. In particular, Asians and Asian Americans have been yelled at, spit on, physically assaulted, blamed by our fellow Americans for being the cause of this present pandemic. But this is not a new phenomenon. We have been scapegoats for many adversities and hard times that we had nothing to do with. World War II, 9/11, the crisis of the early 1980s that led to the murder of Vincent Chin. What is different is that we have learned from these many past incidences to stand up for ourselves and each other, to organize, to educate, to resist. So tonight, to address anti-Asian racism past and present, our hopes for the future, the title of our program, we have leading figures in the Asian Pacific American community who have been and continue to be on the front lines of our fight against anti-Asian racism. Russell Jeung, Robin Toma, Renee Tajima-Peña, and Taz Ahmed. I will introduce them individually, and then they will have an opportunity to speak for about 10 minutes. And after they all are able to speak, we'll take questions from the audience. So first we'll hear from Russell Jeung, who is chair and professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State. A scholar of race and religion, he's written At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among Ancestors as Well as Family Sacrifices, the Worldviews of Ethics of Chinese Americans. But in February, concerned with the rising hostility against Asian Americans during this pandemic, he conducted a study and found that media coverage of COVID-19 related to xenophobia was up by 50% in just 4 weeks. In March, Russell and the Chinese for Affirmative Action and APCON, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, started a website on which people can record incidences of harassment in 7 languages. It's called Stop API Hate, which has since received more than 1,700 reports. Especially in this new day of fake news, we really need these hard, fast numbers, and Russell has them. So Russell, if you could join me on the virtual stage, please.
Thanks, Karen. I'd like to thank the Japanese American National Museum for inviting me today, and I appreciate Karen's remarks about remembering George Floyd and recognizing our solidarity with other communities of color during this particular time. As Karen talked about, we're really trying to learn from our history. And when COVID-19 was coming from China, as an Asian American studies scholar, I knew Asians would be scapegoated, and we wanted to document what was happening in order to prove that harassment and discrimination weren't isolated incidents, but were going to be a widespread, prevalent issue facing Asian Americans. We asked the Attorney General in California to create a reporting center, and he said he didn't have the capacity, so we created through CAA and APCON our own reporting center, and immediately we were flooded with responses. And I'm going to share some of them with you. You could see verbal harassment and shunning make up the most of the cases, but these aren't mere microaggressions. Asians are getting sworn at, they're getting yelled at, they're having racial epithets and slurs slung at them. And in many of the cases, elderly and youth are present. Actually, one interesting fact is that you don't think of Asian American senior citizens going online and complaining about racism, but 8% of our respondents are seniors, Asian American seniors. We're having our civil rights violated. You can see workplace discrimination, being barred from establishments and being barred from transportation. Those are all civil rights violations that we could actually seek legal remedy for. Unique to the pandemic is that we're getting coughed and spat upon in really high rates. It was so striking, and it was such a trend that we actually created a special category to code being coughed and spat upon. It's debasing, it's humiliating, it's demeaning, and I think people feel like Asians are infecting us so we can reinfect them. On the East Coast, a white person got arrested for terrorism for coughing on groceries and coughing on the white cashier. And he got arrested for terrorism. So you could say and make a case that Asians are experiencing mass terrorism now because we're coughed on and spat upon so often on a daily basis. It's clearly a public health threat. And although not reported to the police, we're getting physically assaulted often, getting pushed and shoved, having rocks and bottles thrown at us. These are hate crimes that are arrestable, that are racially motivated. And in the worst, most egregious case, a refugee family from Burma shopping at Sam's Club were attacked from behind and slashed in the head, a 2-year-old, a 7-year-old, and the father. And the assailant said, "The corona happens because of you," and he thought they were Chinese. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. We know it's a lot more pervasive across the country, and we knew we needed to document it. It's a case of racial profiling. You could see how many reportees say that race was a reason for discrimination. 60% of our respondents are actually non-Chinese. If you read the incident reports, people are saying it's because of you, Chinese, go back to China. So they're really blaming and China bashing. But again, they can't tell East Asians from from Chinese. So Vietnamese, Koreans, Japanese are reporting. We have over 24 reports on our Japanese language site. The face mask is now the new racialized object of scorn. You know, after a 9/11, if you had a look like the stereotyped terrorist, even if you're like South Asian and Sikh, you would get racialized if you wore a turban. Now, if you're Asian and wear a face mask, you get racialized as being infected and being a disease carrier. And so we have high rates, 18% of people saying that it's because they wear a face mask that they're discriminated against. Now that everybody is supposed to wear a face mask, though, Asians are getting harassed for not wearing face masks. You're perceived as being infected but negligent. Gender is another big factor. Although it's not often suspected, Asian American women are being harassed 2.5 times more than men. So it's clear to me that people are picking on whom they perceive are vulnerable. Again, our elderly, children, and women. And in terms of the sites of discrimination, because we're sheltered in place, the only place now Asians have interactions with other are business sites, stores. And so we need to hold corporations accountable because we're supposed to have public accommodation, safe access to goods and services, but we're not getting that. A lot of the other sites are public sites, sidewalks, subways, buses, and that's where we have to hold government accountable. So this is going on, and we knew that this was going to happen because of our history. As many of you know about, the yellow peril stereotype has been around for centuries now. It's that stereotype that we're forever foreign, that we're threats to the West, that will come and dominate the West. And this was actually the basis of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that Asians and Chinese in particular were disease carriers who are threatening the West with their pandemics. In this picture, malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were specters emanating from Chinatown, coming to bring disease and kill off Americans. And so that was the basis of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So you have the fear of Asians bringing diseases, that leads to interpersonal violence, and that leads to racist legislation. The same thing happened when the bubonic plague came in 1900. San Francisco Chinatown was actually quarantined and roped off with barbed wire and ropes. Whites were allowed to go in and out, but Chinese were segregated and kept inside to get infected. In Honolulu and Santa Ana, California Chinatowns, they were both burned down during the bubonic plague, which ironically spread the rats. So the San Francisco Chronicle actually said that the bubonic plague epidemic has parallels to today. And we're seeing that. In the past, a disease would come from China, Asians would be scapegoated, would be targeted with interpersonal violence, and would have racist policies like the Chinese Exclusion Act or other health policies directed to control them. We've been excluded, we've been quarantined, we've been detained, and we've been deported all through health policies. Angel Island, they would detain and deport people again if they weren't medically fit. So we're seeing that today. We have thousands of cases after COVID-19 has arrived of Asians being met with interpersonal violence. And we've been met already with the mass immigration ban. And just today, the Republican Party introduced legislation to exclude Chinese students in STEM. So this is the second Chinese Exclusion Act now being proposed, and you see history being repeated. I just want to close and say, history repeats itself, and throughout time, Asians have always resisted the racism they've met with. They've always combated, and during the Chinese Exclusion Act, as Renee's PBS series shows, Chinese filed lawsuits, they engaged in mass civil disobedience, and they boycotted American goods. So I think today, as we look to the future, I'm hoping and seeing Asian Americans rise up again to fight this current pandemic of racism. And we could talk more about that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Russell. Again, we'll have a chance to have questions and answers afterwards, after the panelists. But now I'd like to introduce Robin Toma. Robin wears many hats. He is the Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations and Assistant Director of the Human Relations Branch of Los Angeles County's Workforce Development, Aging, and Community Services Department. He's also the President of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, an appointee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission's California Advisory Committee, and a senior fellow of UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs. Before working at the county, Robin was an ACLU staff attorney in Los Angeles and litigated a wide range of human rights and civil liberties cases. So Robin knows a thing or two about hate crimes and the fight against them. So Robin, please enter the stage.
Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to JANM for bringing us all together, to Karen for that introduction, to Joy for your work in organizing this. Always a technological challenge, but I really think it's so important that we are coming together for this. And it was great to hear Russell's presentation. Really helped set the stage for, I think, what we're facing here in LA County. One of the things that I just wanted to say before even beginning the slideshow is that, you know, the Commission on Human Relations in LA County was born out of hate violence. The Zoot Suit riots in 1943 gave rise to, and that episode, for I know that many of you think of the Hollywood film or the Broadway play, but it was essentially days of violence targeting Latino men wearing zoot suits of the day by largely white military personnel that were on leave. And there was literally hunting down and pulling people off of streetcars that existed in those days, out of movie theaters, out of restaurants, anyone on the street, and literally beating them, oftentimes with police standing nearby observing. That gave rise to the Committee on Interracial Progress that was formed by the Board of Supervisors, and that later became the Commission on Human Relations. But of course, we know that there was something else was going on in Los Angeles County and the country after December 7th, 1941, and that was Pearl Harbor and the subsequent incarceration of Japanese Americans throughout the country. And many of us, I'm sure that are on this call, have a personal connection to that. My mother and her entire family found themselves in Tule Lake, and then later Minidoka, Idaho, in those prison camps. And I think about, because of where we are right now, what that must have been like in the days following December 7th. The kind of fear and hysteria and prejudice that was already there, but whipped up by the fears of that moment, led to probably so many cases of harassment and discrimination far beyond what we know of, because in those days, it wasn't as if there was a place for people to report those things. They're only starting in 1990, was it mandatory here in California for law enforcement to report hate crimes. And they had not even been trained that thoroughly on it, so they weren't reporting what they didn't look for. So much has changed since then. I will say that another part of that history that's often not spoken of is that our government even went after those Japanese in other countries in Latin America and used them for prisoner exchange, and then proceeded to deny them redress under the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Congress looked at that whole episode and said this was an episode that came out of this wartime hysteria and fear, pre-existing prejudice, and the failure of political leadership. And in so many ways, we are reliving that moment in a sense of the hysteria that Russell talked about that is being caused by the pandemic. We know that there's already been a fanning of the flames of prejudice towards the Chinese through the trade wars, as well as the long reservoir of discrimination against Asian Americans throughout US history, where Asians have almost been the face of the enemy in so many of the wars that have been carried out since World War II. And not even for a long time, you would never see a face on television or in other media that wasn't an exotic foreigner who was to be distrusted or was caricatured. So, you know, that is what we're dealing with in terms of the context. And even LA County, which today boasts a wonderful board of supervisors that is a majority women, supermajority of women, a progressive board, back in the day in World War II, they helped facilitate the internment of Japanese Americans under the guise of helping assure that they get employment or protecting them from potential prejudice. To the credit of this board, they actually repealed that action in a symbolic motion several years ago. And I think that today, given what we've been facing, our commission, has been focused on, youth leadership and human relations, on increasing justice in our criminal justice systems, in looking at how equity needs to be pervasive throughout government, and hate violence has been a major focus. So we have been doing this for a very long time, and we have decided recently, though, with the board to expand this in a very ambitious way. You will be hard-pressed to find any government agency that is systematically collecting not just hate crimes, even that is rare, but to go beyond that to acts of hate, hate-motivated hostility, the kinds of things that Russell was talking about is rare to find. So let me share with you some information. So I wanted to point out that the board has taken a number of actions to protect vulnerable communities against hate crime. There were board motions in July 2018 when we were already seeing that there was a continual rise in hate crimes that were being counted each year by all the law enforcement agencies and community partners that provide that information to us. And that's continued to just this last Tuesday when the board passed a motion really urging all the county departments to join the anti-hate campaign that I'm about to tell you more about. We received great support already from the county departments of mental health, as well on the Commission on Quality and Productivity. And what they are supporting is basically a very ambitious initiative that has three major components. One is the fact that we need to unite our community against hate. We know that the vast majority of people in our county and in the country do not see themselves as openly racist, do not support the hate violence and hate attacks that have been reported. And it's not just against Asians, but we've seen this targeting all the most targeted groups in LA County: African Americans, Latinos, Jews, Muslims, the LGBT community, the transgender community. We have seen that over this period, increases in all of those areas, increase in white supremacy, marked hate crime. And we realize that we need to create a way to unite people. But more than that, we don't want to just send a message. We wanted to figure out, how do we find out what is happening, what's really happening, and who's being affected beyond hate crime. Last year, we had 520 some hate crimes reported, actually in the previous year, and that was the highest since 2009. But we know by looking at the numbers that that is, as was mentioned by Russell, severely underreported. So one of the most critical things is, how do we change the fact that we don't know about the hate that's going on? And so we have set up a system for reporting hate, not just hate crime, but any act of hate motivated hostility, through our partnership with 211. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. It's not just reporting it, but we're also wanting to directly assist everyone who reports hate. And not only that, engage our community partners. So the third part is, how do we build our local community capacity to respond and prevent hate acts? We already have a number of partners that have been working with us over the years, but we really felt it was necessary at this time to expand it, especially since we're going to respond to more than just hate crimes. So we've been working with special services for groups and a whole array of community organizations. That's really critical, because that is the way we go from simply knowing about hate to preventing it. This is what we're seeing in terms of COVID-19 hate-related acts in LA County, just from February through May 8th of 2020. There were 93 hate incidents reported. 16 of those were crimes, for a total of 108. And those come from not only 211, our partner, and other sources, but Russell's organization and the website that they've created, Stop API Hate, Chinese for Affirmative Action, and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council have all been working together to be a great source of information as well. We also got reports from the LAPD, West Covina Police Department, and just today I learned about more from the Sheriff's Department. So, you know, oftentimes there's a question about, why are we worrying about something other than hate crimes? Well, we know that this is so critical, not just in terms of acts of hate, but we know it even starts with silent support. When we don't say anything, when we hear something biased being said, when we allow people to harass other people and not stand up for them, that is where it begins. And then when we go along with jokes or other kinds of bigotry that are stereotyping a certain group, that funnels into what then creates an atmosphere where people feel it's okay to carry on acts of hate, that no one's going to do anything about it. And so we know it can get to the very extreme of even a campaign to eliminate a group that has been targeted and vilified. So this is what we're seeing in terms of reports 211. You can see the numbers here are even more substantial, because these include all forms of hate against any group that have been reported. And so, we have people reporting not only through calling 211, but also going to the website. And when we look at what kinds of acts of hate are reported, you can see that bullying actually has been a large part of it, one that was much greater than we expected. Of course, this was at a time when school was in session, and that's that period from September through February. Name calling is a substantial part of it. Threats of violence, a significant part. Physical assaults and battery are 1 out of every 5 of those are reported. We're getting less of the business refusal and graffiti vandalism than we typically get in hate crimes, perhaps because people have been going out to businesses less because of the stay-at-home orders. But we're also seeing some very serious hate crimes, attempted murder, bomb threats, sexual assault, that are part of the reports we've been hearing. And like our hate crimes in general, the overwhelming motivation is targeting people because of their race, ethnicity, or national origin. But disability here is surprising, because that is something that is typically not as high in our hate crime reports. Sexual orientation and religion, also there, that typically is much higher in terms of looking at just hate crimes. So we're seeing a different mix here. When we receive these calls, we respond to and offer services and support to every single caller. And these are the types of things that we've been providing, not just legal aid, but mental health services, counseling, landlord-tenant issues are a big one. We help refer them to law enforcement when it's a hate crime. We deal with all sorts of things: consumer complaints, crisis intervention, information lines and websites that we direct them to, housing support, and referrals also to discrimination. And I want to say that I think that there's an opportunity to really show the community that there is something you can do when you are being mistreated at a business, that there are laws, civil, not necessarily criminal laws, but there are civil rights laws in this state that are very strong. And so we hope that that can be acted on in partnership with our state agency and our communities. So just to move towards our end, I just wanted to highlight that how important it is for folks to report. And this is so critical because I can't tell you, if I were to ask you right now, how many of you have either heard about an act of hate during this period or personally experienced it, I would have bet there would be quite a few of you who'd raise your hands. If I asked you how many of you reported it to any organization, I would guess that it would be very few of you raising your hands. That is a problem that we're facing, a culture that has normalized or accepted that hate like that is just something that there's nothing you can do about it beyond sharing it with friends or family. And we're saying there is. And it's going to be critical for us to know about it, for it to be reported, whether to 211 or to Stop AAPI Hate or whatever a reporting source that can get to us. And I want to say that it's because people need to understand it's not just about getting help, but this is the only way we're going to prevent hate from happening to someone else. That this is the way we are able to know about it so we can intervene and prevent. And so I just want to end on that point, that if you can do anything, please encourage those, even if it happened to them a while ago. If this is something that, if they experience an act of hate, please report it. And that is the way, together with the partnership with all of the organizations that we have been working with, that is the way we're going to change this. And the resistance that Russell talked about, so critical. We have to have partnership with community. We have to together focus not only on reporting it, but also taking action together to respond to those reports of hate. So I look forward to building that work and seeing a really transformative system and relationships and networks and collaborations that are already being built, and we hope to see expand greatly in the coming period. And so with that, that's my note of future for hope, and I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you very much. Renee Tajima-Peña is an award-winning filmmaker multiple times and a professor of Asian American Studies at UCLA. Her work focuses on communities of color, immigration, gender, and social justice. And most recently, she's the series producer of Asian Americans, which was the very first docuseries on Asian American history that just aired 2 weeks ago. I think many of you saw it. Her previous films include Who Killed Vincent Chin, My America, or Honk If You Love Buddha, Labor Women, Skate Manzanar, The New Americans, and No Mas Bebes, which have screened at Cannes, Sundance, and many other festivals around the world. And she also recently launched Building History 3.0, an interactive exploration of Japanese American World War II history through Minecraft. And she's also a longtime and valued friend. So Renee, take it away.
Thanks very much, Karen. I have to say, I've been doing a lot of these discussions. I thought I had nothing else to talk about, but seems like every day there's a new outrage. But also every day the community is really moving forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of context for what we're dealing with today and what we're facing today. The interesting thing about this whole COVID crisis and the anti-Asian hate is it's not only white people targeting Asian Americans, it's also other POCs. At the same time, in our community, we've been dealing with anti-Blackness. We've been dealing with within our communities, even our families, our own prejudices towards other people of color. So those tensions exist. But at the same time, Toni Morrison talked about this master narrative that hasn't been written by us. And in that master narrative, the tension and conflict among people of color is the dominant narrative. But the real narrative has also been this history of solidarity. And so I think it's, what we've been doing is rewriting our own story. And we've been always doing that. But I think that in the harsh light of the fault lines of racism and xenophobia that have emerged during this period of crises, that, is more people are really seeing what the true kind of history and what the true contours of race in America are or is. Sorry, get the grammar wrong. But and more Asian Americans are, accepting that. I mean, a few years ago, people in polite company, they would never say white supremacy, but people are seeing it, right, before their eyes, and really realizing that the roots of hate directed at Asians and the roots of the health disparities directed at poor people, directed at other people of color, and a lot of Asian Americans, they have the same roots, the roots of police violence and the roots of anti-Blackness, has the same roots. That's something we try to look at in the Asian Americans in the PBS series, is these fault lines and how they erupt during times of crises. Of course, for my family, and this event is sponsored by JANM, so for the Japanese Americans, World War II was a time when those fault lines erupted and Japanese Americans were, incarcerated en masse. The Vincent Chin case, during the auto recession, the Japanese car imports were blamed for the violence. And Vincent Chin was killed because he was mistaken for being Japanese. 9/11, after 9/11, for South Asians and Muslim and Arab Americans, in the one interview that Gita Gandenberg did for the series with Hari Kondabolu, Hari said, he was a college student during 9/11, born and raised in Queens, New York, and he felt like he was getting it from both sides. That as a brown person, as a South Asian, on the one hand, he was terrified of terrorism. On the other hand, he felt like his country hated him. And that's where we find ourselves as Asian Americans. I'm afraid of coronavirus. I don't want to get sick. I don't want anybody I love, my family or friends, to get sick. But at the same time, I know that I'm targeted as the virus, the human virus. So I wanted to bring up a clip from the series that really deals with another time of tension and conflict, but also the effort by people of color and Asian Americans to try to find a way forward together, which I think is something that we're all talking about right now. We're all trying to figure out how to do it in a very positive way. I have to say that when this kind of season of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and which coincided with the COVID crises, most people would start the events with also invoking the Vincent Chin case and talking about the Vincent Chin case. But now I hear more and more, like in the same way Karen has talked about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and Asian Americans are seeing that as a part of their fight, a part of the fight against racism that we have to take up as well as the fight against anti-Asian hate. So this was a clip directed by Gita Gandaber, one of our series producers, and it's Los Angeles, 1992. So Joy, if you can put up the videotape. It's actually 2 excerpts.
We had 5 days of looting, burning, arson, chaos, really, in the city of LA.
I had a conversation with my father. We sat on the couch in our living room. He came and sat down next to me. He said that the violence and looting in Koreatown was getting really bad, and that he had to go and defend the store, that he had obtained a gun, and that he was going to go down there and even now it's a very painful memory that basically he may not come back.
Alex's parents' store is destroyed, along with more than 2,000 other Korean-owned businesses.
This is America! We have to stand our pride! Human dignity! Where is our human dignity? We are human beings. We have to have a dignity. We don't do things like this.
I mean, it was one of those moments that actually really changed my life, because it was like war had broken out, and I knew people that I deeply loved on both sides.
There was a consciousness that woke out of the fire and the chaos and the crisis that hit LA. Korean America was born in 1992.
On May 2nd, as the violence subsides, 30,000 people gather in Koreatown for a peace rally.
It was a huge march that took us down Olympic Boulevard. The kind of diversity that you would expect to see in LA. There were African Americans, there were Latinos, there were Koreans, there were whites. Everyone was present. We wanted to send a message that we also want justice and we also want peace.
We had emerging now these new leaders within the Korean American community. And this leadership has been working with the African American leadership to move forward.
We have a dream, as late Martin Luther King had a dream, that we together would be able to establish a nation of justice and peace. And we are here to stay.
My parents were shopkeepers, and I think it would take a little bit of time for me to think through what all these things meant. Like every population, Asian Americans have choices to make. They can dwell on their own victimization, which is a choice that is there for every so-called minority and for the majority. They can choose to side with power or to be complicit with power and to be perpetrators, or to at least enjoy the profits of being aligned with perpetrators. Or they could refuse these kinds of choices and instead seek to transform the system into something more just, more equitable for everyone. That's the hope of activism, that's the hope of solidarity, that's the hope of alliance, that's the hope and the conviction from which something like the Asian American movement was born.
Okay, so, I'd like to leave you with this kind of idea of one thing, I think what Viet Thanh Nguyen said in his closing remarks in that clip was really, so timely for us today as Asian Americans, is we do have choices. We've always had those choices, but today it's just, in this crisis, it's really amplified. But another thing he had said in when we interviewed him, or Gita interviewed him about the Vincent Chin case, is that for Asian Americans, they weren't shocked because it's a new story. It was an old story. And again, you know, these fault lines go back to when Asian Americans first arrived, but also these moments of, these points of solidarity go back. I mean, it goes back to Frederick Douglass, who denounced the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It goes back to the South Asian immigrants who came here in the 1900s, many of them laborers, and many were influenced by the Marcus Garvey movement and were really involved in the anti-colonial movement. The editor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World was an Indian immigrant. The Black Movement for Equality, which, you know, opened doors for Asian Americans, you know, knocked down anti-miscegenation laws, segregation, you know, it created opportunities through affirmative action, housing, jobs, you know, in every sense, it opened doors for us. And there are figures like Edison Uno and Raymond Okamura, who not only fought for equality for Japanese Americans and for the redress and reparations movement, but they stood alongside Black activists in repealing the Emergency Detention Act in the 1960s. There's a fear among African Americans that they would be also rounded up and incarcerated like Japanese Americans because of the rise of activism. The new generation of Asian Americans have for years been allies in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that, you know, that's the narrative, the new narrative. It's an old story, but maybe it's a new narrative for a lot of us. And I think that's what we can really look to now as we're building our future. And the infrastructure is there. The anti-racist infrastructure in the Asian American community has been there for decades and generations and generations. And I think it's just right now getting stronger. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. You know, our last speaker is Taz Ahmed. Taz is a multi-talented activist, storyteller, Politico based in Los Angeles. She was the campaign strategist at the Asian American New Media Organizing Group, 18 Million Rising, and also was the co-host of Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast, which was one of my favorites. But you can access it still and listen to it and download it if you like. She's an avid essayist who had a column called Radical Love and has been published in many anthologies and outlets, including The Nation and Truth Out. She's also a poet. Her third poetry chapbook, M' and Ellipses, was published in early 2016. And if that's not enough, Taz is also a music curator and producer at Misty Music, and an artist whose work has been featured in Sharia Revoiced and the Smithsonian's Asian Pacific American Center. And before you start, I'm going to ask you, we received a question from a member of the audience, and I'd just like for you to respond to that, if you might. She writes, I hope that one of the panelists will define racism as it's intended to be used on this webinar, since a lot of this discussion on hate crimes is quite broad. So Taz, if you could tackle that, I'd appreciate it.
Just an easy question, just a simple one. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I'm very intimidated to be here. My co-panelists have been stellar. I think how I would define racism is discrimination or prejudice based on race. I think specifically living in this society where white supremacy is our mode of existing, I would define that around like racism where is upholding whiteness in the systematic sense. I wanted to jump in to talk a little bit about just kind of my background and where I'm coming from when it comes to this moment in time. I'm going to share my PowerPoint as everyone else has been. Let's see. Okay. And for context for me, I'm a Muslim activist, Muslim organizer, and I wanted to bring it back to January of 2017. I think one of the things I've been hearing a lot in the past couple months with regards to COVID-19 and just how terrible it's been. We have 100,000 deaths in this country, and everyone's kind of saying, I've been hearing a lot of, I can't believe it got this bad. I can believe it got this bad because of what we saw happen with the Muslim ban. That was like one of the most immediate actions that the current administration took. This is an image of people protesting the Muslim ban at the airports. And for me, this is kind of setting the stage for what I want to talk about. We had a lot of activism that happened immediately, we meaning the Muslim American community. We did a lot of activism, and as well as an organization that I'm part of here in Los Angeles, which JANM members should know, Vigilant Love. Vigilant Love is a group where we do a lot of solidarity work between Japanese American and Muslim Americans. And with the rhetoric that we were hearing from the administration, we saw an immediate increase in hate crimes. Of course, it all goes hand in hand. The Chapel Hill shooting happened, I believe, around that time. Mosques were getting burned. Bacon was getting put on doorknobs. In fact, the 6 months after the elections, we saw a 91% increase in hate crimes. And the thing that I want to say about this is that there's been study also done on how the hate has come about. And there's two reports from the Center for American Progress. One is called Fear Inc. and the other one's called Fear Inc. 2. And they did research on how all this hate was being funded. The hate was being funded through 74 different groups. And the data shows that between 2008 and 2013, $206 million went into these 78 foundations, I think through maybe like 7 foundations that were funding this. So for me, what that signals to me is systematic oppression. This isn't an individual person just doesn't like another person, that's why they're hating on each other. There's a system in place that is very well funded, that is using fear-mongering as a tactic to rally the base. This is a slide that I'm stealing from the Race Narrative Project. I saw this last week on one of their presentations, and it totally resonated with me. They say that in their research that the core elements of the right-wing narrative is using racial fear to feed into economic resentment and disgust with the government, which we can see happening with the COVID narrative. All of a sudden, the masks are being used as a cultural tactic. There's no science behind it. And the face masks are being, if you wear a face mask, you are falling into the trap of the disgusting government. There's also so much economic resentment. The rally cry that these people going to the Capitol protesting want to go back to work just kind of is really sad and really actually in contrast with all the other protests we've been seeing this week with George Floyd's murder. And this triangle really resonated with me for kind of what we see happening. I always say that fear-mongering is a tactic of the right, but the economic resentment and disgusting government just kind of added the layer that I hadn't really thought much about, but really made sense to me. And then you all might have seen this happen. This was last week. We see the dog whistle coming out of the White House through comments that he makes. This is the moment where this Asian American reporter was asking a question of the president, and he completely dismissed her and said, "Why don't you go ask China?" And of course, when the president says stuff like this, it signals to his base to commit these hate crimes, which is why we have been seeing an increase in hate crimes. But we have a history of this. I was looking through my archives and just wanted to share these two images from the 1970s. And then I feel like everyone has already talked about this, the history that we have of government policies and how they have been affecting the Asian American community. And this slide is from Vigilant Love. And so how are we gonna, change the future, which is what this conversation is about. There's our philosophy with Vigilant Love, at least, is combat the dominant narrative. So this is telling the counter narratives of the community, narrative building, culture shifting, shift how people are thinking. The second, of course, is policies. How are we changing the policies out there? This is signing the petitions. This is organizing. This is taking to the streets in Minneapolis this week. And then the third one is addressing real world consequences. And I think we've really seen that in the past couple months with all the mutual aid work that's been happening and the donations that have been, donations to support people have been happening. We've been seeing so much of that in Los Angeles. It's been wonderful to see. And this combination is how we need to attack this. We can't just do it. We can't just do it one way. This is a tool that I wanted to share when it comes to what is the narrative that we're trying to shift. This comes from the organization used to be Culture Strike. Now it's the Center for Cultural Power. Fabiana Rodriguez is the executive director there. So they have this guide. You can access it. I found it through their Twitter account. It's a PDF, 29 pages. And they have basically 6 messages that they're asking artists and creators to use when creating content to combat COVID. So in this one, this is their first one, which is a just and sustainable, joyful world is possible and necessary. So they have all these examples of conversations you can say and slogans on the bottom, which I thought was really great. And so they do this for all 6 of their points. And I think what's so great about this is that we can create, as a creative, as an artist, and as an activist, we can create a cohesive message across the movement to combat how people are addressing COVID and how they're not addressing COVID. These are some examples that I've been seeing happening in the Asian American community specifically. This one to the left is the Asian American Feminist Antibodies, which is a zine that's coming out of this amazing group out of New York. It came out almost immediately after the lockdowns happened. It has a bunch of tools in there about how to stay safe in the time of coronavirus. The Take Out Hate campaign, we've seen a lot of Asian restaurants being affected. No one's going to Asian restaurants at a higher rate than other restaurants, especially for takeout food, because we can't go into restaurants right now. So this is a campaign to encourage people to go eat at Asian restaurants. Hashtag Takeout Hate. The middle one, the Namaste, is I put that in there because I think it's a great artist tool. So there's a lot of artists that are making content right now that are culturally relevant. And then there's also this awesome tool from South Asians for Black Lives. It's an Instagram account. They have this anti-racism resource checklist to help people out. But they have a bunch of resources there. But there's, this is all to symbolize that there's so much creativity happening in our community. In this moment of crisis, even though we're all stuck in our house, people are responding in all these really beautiful artistic and amazing ways to still connect. We're doing it now over the internet. And this is a quote from the Black Lives Matter Healing Kit. At the very root of healing justice is an analysis of trauma and resilience, of our need as Black people to care for each other and organize for freedom. We may not always realize that we are navigating our own trauma at almost every step of our lives. Our perspectives, the way we build relationships, and our responses to conflict are informed in large part by the ways in which we have been traumatized and what opportunities, if any, we have had to heal from that trauma. So this is really, I just wanted to share this just because we're at this moment, we need to really understand that however we act, we are coming from a place of resilience, and we need to be in solidarity with each other. This is the big question I wanted to leave everyone with. How do we counter fear-mongering with culture shifting and imagining a new way of being? This week has been really a lot. This whole past couple months has been a lot. But I keep thinking about this images from when a handful of us were taken to Ferguson. This was pictures from Ferguson 100 days after Mike Brown was shot. And it was an API artist delegation that the Asian Pacific American Labor Center had gotten 5 of us to go out there as artists for the Asian American community to create solidarity and to build community so that we can be artists and be in community together and find new ways of being together. And I keep thinking about this as I look back on all the content that's been coming up with George Floyd's murder, that we really do need to be creative, and not just be creative, we need to find new ways of being together and existing together if we're gonna combat this, what's happening. I talked so fast. I hope I did everything that needed to be there. There's 2 things I wanted more to mention that came up because I was inspired by what everyone was saying. The first one is, like, we've been talking about COVID-19 in terms of how people are being affected by hate crimes and hate incidences, but we also have to keep in mind that there's so many other ways our community is being affected right now too. I'm thinking particularly people are going into hospitals, Asian Americans are going into, well, Asian monolinguals folks are going to hospitals without access to translators. And that's a huge issue. And they're being put on ventilators and they don't have access to, people to help translate for them. There's also issues of people dying at different rates. We don't have all the data yet, but we know people of color, especially Black people, are dying at a higher rate. There isn't that much data on Asian Americans, obviously, always. And the labor issues. The labor class is being most affected because they're seen as essential workers, and we see that they are the ones that either as doctors or Amazon workers, they are getting affected a lot, and we know that is disproportionately Asian American. So these are some things that I want to make sure that we touch upon before we end this panel, and I'll leave it there, and hopefully we can also get data for all of that too. I'll pass it back to Karen.
Okay, thank you so much, Taz. That was amazing. No going back. It's a good slogan. And thank you all the panelists. If you could put on your video now and unmute yourself. We're going to have time for some questions and answers from the audience, and actually, if you would like to ask each other anything as well. But we have one from Jeff Chop. What is law enforcement's priority on anti-Asian hate crimes? Will they come, and how will they respond? So I would just invite any of you to respond to that.
So our commission in the county has been working with law enforcement agencies in LA County. There are so many of them, 46 different ones, Sheriff's Department, LAPD being the largest. And we have, for years, been working to train them about recognizing hate crime and making a priority. And there are a number of agencies, LAPD, I'd say, is one of them that has really taken to heart and trained, have hate crime coordinators at every station. But if, you know, there are clearly folks who are not getting the kind of response that they want from law enforcement. We know that because the state did an audit recently and found that there was misclassifying of hate crimes, not recognizing them when they were reported, that some of the training policies of some departments were not up to speed. And so we're working with them on that. And I know that there are specific people in both of those agencies that have been tasked with the work of hate crimes. I would say if you're not getting a response from them the way that you would expect, or you're hearing about it, please let us know, because that is something that we are actively working on. In fact, right now we're developing a report that is identifying the ways in which the Sheriff's Department, the LAPD, and other police agencies need to strengthen their hate crime work. So it's, you know, as always, it's a work in progress. There's high-level leadership commitment to it, but we need to know when they're falling short, because that happens oftentimes at you know, at the patrol level or in other places.
Yeah, you know, for hate crimes, I don't know if better enforcement will actually stop the hate. And that's why we're sort of approaching this with a restorative justice model, a transforming communities model, an ethnic studies model, where rather than trying to criminalize communities, we want to, like all the other speakers said, develop greater empathy among communities, to use training and more rebuild. You know, what happens is get bullied, they become bullies themselves, right? Abused people become abusers. And I don't want the Asian American community, as we get bullied, to become bullies ourselves and just want harsh punishment. I don't want to hear these sort of like Korean black LA riots of Asians buying guns. You know, that's just sort of the sensationalization of creating wedges between communities. So again, at least Stop API's hate approach is to do more restorative justice and to transform communities at the grassroots level. You know, we need structural change to address the hate. We also have to stop, like Taz was talking about, really flipping the narrative. I really know now that words matter. You know, I didn't think these official pronouncements from governments were that important, but when the current administration keeps on insisting on using the term Chinese virus, that creates this association of the virus being Chinese and Chinese people having the virus. And so we really have to flip that narrative to decouple that association and have different ways about talking about the pandemic and different ways of addressing hate crimes.
Yeah, I agree with Russell. I mean, we believe that there should be consequences for people who carry out acts of hate and hate violence, but we also don't believe that adding more prison time or incarcerating people is the answer. We know that it's critical for there to be better education, there to be healing, there to be really responding to this from a place of compassion and understanding and change, because we don't believe that putting people in prison does lead to the prevention of hate. It actually, in many cases, just fuels it. So we agree with that completely. And we, in fact, have, as part of our program, we are working with folks who do healing practices as part of the response to these reports of hate. Because we know it's not just going to get solved by, assistance to the victim that doesn't recognize that there is damage done to relationships between communities as well.
You know, we have another question that maybe Renee and or Taz can address. It says, while we understand the systemic racism violence factors at play, can you speak to how you reconcile the two seemingly conflicting narratives of one, report to authorities and do not be silent complicit, and yet two, be an ally and do not be quick to report as it may result in death, especially if the other party perpetrator is a POC? Renee, Taz?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. Just an hour ago, it was revealed that what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis was an Arab Muslim shop owner that called the cops on George Floyd because he said that the allegedly the $20 was a counterfeit. So we have a story where we have an Arab Muslim shop owner calling the police on a Black man, and the Black man subsequently gets killed he's kneed on by 4 white guys, and standing next to them, standing watch, is an Asian American, a Hmong man. And the specific man that's doing the kneeing has an Asian American wife, Hmong beauty pageant contestant. And so we have this like narrative that's just so like, there's so many stories that are interlaid here. Like we have that gendered story where we know that like when it comes to white supremacy that they often have Asian American women as wives. We have the story of the Asian American man that's a police officer. We have the story of the Arab man that's surveilled. He's probably in Minneapolis. We know that there's a deep countering violent extremism program there. His community is very surveilled over there. So this is such a complicated question because we, as community members, we know that we shouldn't calling the cops on a $20 counterfeit thing is not something that I would suggest anyone doing. I think calling the cops should be the absolute last resource. But I do think that calling the cops is not the same as reporting hate crimes, because hate crime reporting is data collection, and we need the data collection so that we can make the policies that we need. But I think all of this is so complicated. It's so complicated. I don't even know. I don't have words for it yet because it just was revealed. But there's so many layers to this narrative. I'll pass it to Renee to.
I mean, I don't have much more to add, but I think Taz brought up and others brought up, white supremacy is not an attitude, it's a system. So, when you're dealing with a system, there are all these contradictions and complications. But I think just being clear on that is like a first step, because I don't think people are necessarily clear on that. This is a time when we have to be able to hold like different ideas in our heads. It's like with I'm kind of going off track, but like the characterization of the Kung flu or Chinese virus. On the one hand, there's a lot to criticize China as a state in terms of, keeping information from their own population. But on the other hand, they're racializing a disease and putting a target on the back of anybody who people presume to be Chinese. So those two things can happen at the same time. You can be an Asian American cop and, have a whole history of your own people of being targets of racism, not a history, but, something ongoing. But at the same time, like Viet was pointing out, you can be allied with the perpetrators and you make that choice. So these things happen all at the same time. But I really do think there's more clarity in our community, which that's something, didn't just happen in the past couple of months. It's just something that, people have been really doing the hard work over many years.
Another question came up is, that now there's a lot of reaction. There's a lot of fires. There's a lot of protest in Minneapolis and right here in LA as well. So how do APIs respond to that?
Well, I think that all of the panelists have talked about how important it is for us to be in solidarity with other communities who are facing violence, discrimination, racism. We've seen that, and that's part of what we're trying to create through our programs by funding a lot of different community organizations so that they work together in responding to hate. And we think that, it's so important, and particularly after 9/11, we saw the kind of targeting of Asians as well as Muslims, as literally almost every ethnic and racial group was targeted in the flurry of anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern hostility. So I think that it is, Vigilant Love has been an amazing example of how the Japanese American community has been in solidarity with the Muslim community. We see many examples of that in our community. And I think that this is a critically important moment for Asian Americans to stand in solidarity with the African American community and the kind of violence that they've been suffering in the police. And I think that's just, so important to our strength as a community that we do that.
I think the thing that I want to add specifically for what's happening in Minneapolis, this is very micro. There's the Minneapolis Freedom Fund. They are funding the bail for protesters from this week who are getting locked up. Please donate to them. That is at this point, this is the best way to stand in solidarity is in this instance, with the pocketbook. And I'll drop the link right here.
Thank you. There's two other questions that are kind of related, so I'm going to read both of them together. And this is actually a really good way to end and to conclude. So if each of you could respond, with some of your last words and kind of take home messages. So one is. While we understand the systemic racism violence factors at play, oh, I'm sorry, did I already say that? Yeah, okay. There's a long list here. Over the decades, APIs and other POCs have often tried to join forces on various issues, but most attempts are short-lived. In the post-COVID era, do you see all of our communities coming together to build bridges and real long-lasting change? If so, how? And before you think about that, and let me find the other one that is kind of related. For a long time, Asian Americans have been able to almost fly under the radar and escape the same level of overt racism and persecution that people from the Black community still face to this day. With COVID, that scab has been ripped off, and now our communities are facing similar acts of hate and violence. But anti-Blackness is something that is also perpetuated in many Asian communities. How can we come together as all people of color to really and truly reconcile racially as people of color, and then move forward with work to eliminate systemic majority-driven racism? So I think this is where, we're all, many of you have responded to this, but this is sort of driving where we're going to be going in order to no going back and to create a new, better normal. So if each of you could give us your thoughts on how we can do that, how we can rise in solidarity in a very meaningful way in order to eliminate the systemic racism that we're all feeling right now.
I don't necessarily believe that we're facing the same level of violence because, so far as Asian Americans, we're not getting lynched by the police. So I think it's, I hate to make those kinds of comparisons. I mean, things are going to get worse, obviously, because the GOP has made it very clear that they're going to run on an anti-China platform. So that's going to come down on Asian Americans. But the kind of history of systemic violence towards African Americans and brown people. I mean, I'll tell you, my husband's Mexican American, and so my husband and my brother, who's Japanese American, same age, had the same graduate degree from UCLA, same kind of, record of being like working for the city, county, numbers guys, wear dockers and have glasses, look very mild-mannered. My husband will never, if there's a traffic stop, he will wait until he finds a lighted place with people. He will not stop until then. My brother doesn't worry about that. I mean, we just know in our lives that it's a lot different. I don't worry when my kid goes out in the same way a Black parent worries about their kid, like just, walking down the street. So I think, having clarity about that is part of the answer of how, we go forward in terms of solidarity, just, knowing the roots of white supremacy and racism, and, then in being, working as allies on many different levels.
Yeah, I could follow up Renee's comment. I think we have to recognize both Asian privilege at this moment, but also recognize the darkness of the times. So, and I really want to learn from the Muslim experience, even as recently as Taz talked about the Muslim ban. Things are going to get worse for Asian Americans because China bashing is a presidential campaign issue. And as they bash China, they're going to bash Chinese people and bash people who look Chinese in the US. With the economy tanking, it goes back to Vincent Chin days. People are angry, people are fearful, and they're going to look for a scapegoat. With people being sheltered in place longer, they're already protesting and frustrated. And as deaths mount with COVID-19, people are going to look for a scapegoat. So if we're going to learn from history, we have to recognize that Asians are going to be met with more interpersonal violence, and they're going to have more policies enacted against them. Already we have the mass immigration ban. We have today introduced the second Chinese Exclusion Act to exclude Chinese students. So we're already seeing it. So even though, like Renee said, we recognize, yeah, maybe the racism Asians face isn't so bad, so we have to recognize our own anti-Blackness. That's true. But we also have to be vigilant that it will get darker, and that we have to be aware of history, and that we have to learn from history, even recent history that Muslims and Arabs have faced. So given that, I think my hope is that as Asians are now being racially profiled as outsiders and as threats, then maybe our community could better understand what it's like to be mass detained, what it's like to be mass incarcerated, what it's like to be mass banned, because we're now beginning to experience it. And the more we can develop an empathy and understanding of that mistreatment, again, it may not be the levels of the other groups, but then just getting that inkling and getting that empathy would build that solidarity. We are building those networks. We have learned from the past. Some of these Asian American groups have been around for 50 years now, right? Ethnic studies is really building that movement. And so we want to build on that history that we've had. We want to develop that greater empathy and solidarity that we have with other community colors. And then we need that moral imagination that Taz and Renee and other creatives develop to think of a better way to change the narrative. So that's my hope, that with groups like the Japanese American National Museum, and as we get together and continue to discuss these things, that we can imagine morally a better way to be and to connect. Solidarity is really fragile. I don't know how I could be more there on the front lines in the fires in Minneapolis when I'm dealing with all the thousands of cases that of hate that I'm trying to, deal with that are facing Asian Americans. I want to be there on that front line. I have to, deal with both. So it's both and. We can't be everywhere. We have to recognize our limits. And so I just want to acknowledge that we're human too at this moment. So as much as we want to be fighting fires and protesting everywhere, we got to, claim our place and then trust that others have our back.
I can go next. I think for me, the thing that I'm thinking about is systematic white supremacy is using fear-mongering of people of color against each other to exhaust us. They're trying to use, this is a tactic to keep us exhausted, to keep us fighting each other instead of fighting white supremacy systematically. And I think that that's something that we really have to acknowledge, is that I think so often we kind of get pulled into this conversation where we're just like, oh, we need to do solidarity in XYZ way, without understanding that we're kind of in a system. We're in this kind of system that's trying to keep us in place. And that's what we have to break. We don't need to break. It's not a personal one-on-one relationship. Like, we have a huge system to break. I don't know how we're going to break that system. It's huge, but we can't do what we've been doing over and over again. I think I'm so saddened by these protests this week, because these are the same protests we did when Mike Brown was shot. We've been doing these protests for so long. It's so exhausting. And it's so exhausting that we're just responding. We're just reacting, and we're not being proactive about how we're going to actually take down the system. We're just responding to these attacks one after another. And they're just killing us off one at a time. And it's a lot. And we have to be better than that. I think the other thing that we really need to also do is center anti-Blackness as Asian Americans. And that's not hard to do. There's books out there. There's make friends with people, have these important, engaging conversation, and look into history. We have a really deep history of, the Yellow Peril movement being tied to the Black Panther movement. We know that Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X used to collaborate together. Like, we have a rich history of, especially when it comes to the Black community, we do have a history of us working together in activist spaces. Reese Lee Boggs used to do it all the time. So just do your research and do the history there, and know that what we're doing isn't anything new, but we are trying to reimagine a new way of doing it. We're standing on the, is that what you say? Standing on the backs of your ancestors?
Shoulders.
Shoulders. Not on backs, on shoulders, to move forward and to have new ways of being. But I mean, I also want to acknowledge that, like, I think for the real change that has to happen, we haven't seen it yet. And we have to have a new way of thinking, a new way of transforming to make this happen. And that's going to require radical imagination, and that's going to require some really huge changes that we might not be ready for. But I think that's what we need right now, because it's coming. It's going to happen.
The only thing I would add to the wonderful words that I think have been shared, and, as Renee said, that there's sometimes conflicting sounding ideas, but, you really have to hold them all and recognize that many conflicting things can be true. I think we're in an extraordinary moment right now where there has been such targeted harm of so many different communities from a blatantly white supremacist system that is being articulated in a way that has, I think, created an opportunity for us to really come together. And I think that is the upside of where we are. I do think that it's going to require imagination. It's going to require also the focus on each individual issue that Russell talked about, dealing with the thing before us. But what I want to put out there is that, where we've had coalitions before, oftentimes they break apart because we enter in them with the idea that somehow we idealize that these are going to be perfect alliances where there won't be differences, there won't be instances of mistrust. And I think that we have to enter these kinds of coalitions and alliances with the way that we enter into personal relationships, with the recognition that conflict is inevitable and that we need to build in the way of working out those differences from the get-go. Because I've seen so many coalitions fall apart, so many alliances break apart because of one act of one group that creates distrust on the other side. Before you know it, they're not talking to each other anymore. We cannot do that. We have to learn to work through conflict, recognize that we have different histories, different cultures, different approaches, different priorities, but we have to align on the fundamental principles. And I think that, that's I think there's a wonderful opportunity here, and I think it's up to us to either seize on it or miss it.
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing panel. Really, thank you for your time, your expertise, your insight, and all the important work that you've been doing. And thank you for the audience for joining us. This was just the first program of a new JANM series that Joy is putting together, exploring race and racism in the United States. And it's called Reimagining Normal, because as she writes, we need to reflect on how we can go beyond going back to our old normal after this pandemic, and instead imagine a new society that continues to dismantle and fight against racism and prejudice. So I hope that you all tune in for the next program. Till then, stay safe and vigilant, and I am now going to turn this back over to Joy.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much to you, Karen, and Renee, and Robin, and Russell, and Taz. This has been truly just an incredible afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I hope that you all in the audience, we can't see you, but I hope you're giving a round of applause with me as I was on mute here. And just, I have a few logistical notes to close out on. I'm putting a survey in the chat. If you could please fill that out. Help us put more programming on like this, as Karen mentioned. We want to continue this conversation. We want to continue to do something about these topics that we're talking about. So if you can just let us know what you want to see and what you thought of the program today, that would be incredibly helpful. And then also continue to check out janm.org for future JANM from home content and experiences. And if you liked what you saw today, please consider supporting JANM in all the ways that we mentioned before. We'll be sending a follow-up email. And yeah, just join me please in saying thank you one more time to all these incredible panelists. We're going to be closing out now, but you all are amazing. This was incredible, and thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.